Are you still carrying around these analog video cables hoping your next TV might support 240p or 480i and let you play your games? Do you dream of a time where you can actually see Mario as he saves the princess, or where you can feel your actions happen instantaneously when you press the button on your controller? Your video signal no longer needs to suffer. At last, there is hope.
The EON Super 64 changes everything. It slots into the back of your Nintendo 64 game console and invites it into the modern digital realm. No power cables or analog shenanigans required. Just bring an HDMI cable and your TV and get ready to game.
Whoa! HDMI! Progressive scan! No way! EON Super 64!
Available now.
3 days left in our lowest prices of the year because Toys R Us is closing forever. Come down to...
Now your child can visit steamy jungles, grassy plains, and
The EON Super 64 is a small device which plugs into the back of your Nintendo 64 game console and converts the best possible, without modifications, video signal on original hardware to HDMI without even needing its own power cable. This is clearly the simplest solution for just about anyone, even people who aren't super retro enthusiasts or techies, to get their Nintendo 64 working on their modern television. But does it live up to the promise of a beautiful video signal and lag-free gaming experience? And is it worth the beefy asking price? In short, yes and no. In this video, I'll be covering my review of the EON Super 64, how it works, how it compares to competing options, and I'll show you how to optimize your live streams while using it or the competing options, as well as some capture card choices and so on. If you want to pick up a Super 64 for yourself, I recommend ordering from Castlemania Games. I have an affiliate link in the video description, as well as a coupon code, EPOSVOX, to save 10% on your order. The device comes in a very stylized box, which kind of resembles the N64 console itself, and it comes with the Super 64 and a tiny manual of sorts. No HDMI cable, you will need to bring your own, and no power cable either. It's odd for these kind of converters, usually they require micro USB power or something like that, but EON is actually leveraging the accessible 5 volts power over HDMI and powering itself from the HDMI cable directly. Pretty neat stuff. Though I can imagine this would cause some headaches on cheaper passive HDMI switchers, but I didn't encounter any issues with that specifically myself. You're presented with a big LED to confirm that it's working, and then a small blue LED that represents the slick mode toggle on the left-hand side, which attempts to smooth out some of the hard edges of the console's video output. We'll talk more about that in a bit, because it's kind of controversial. The weird bump at the end is actually to help support the device when sitting on a flat surface to help reduce strain on the connector. Pretty handy. Otherwise, this fits in the standard multi-out jack on the back of your N64 perfectly. With this device, you get a 720 by 480 59.94 Hz, although that can vary with like 59.83 Hz due to Nintendo's weird signals from their older consoles, at Rec 601 color space and limited or partial HDMI range. This is important for streaming stuff later. EON claims this will work with any TV, and I haven't encountered any within my very limited testing scope that it didn't work with, but some switchers, splitters, or capture devices may have trouble. I document the capture cards that it works and doesn't work with later in the video. The signal is fairly nice and clean. It's coming from an S-Video source, as that's the best possible quality built into the original native hardware. No RGB support from Nintendo on this console like the Super Nintendo, sadly. So it only goes so far, but it ends up looking pretty nice, even blown up on my big 4K TV. The processing chip inside the Super 64 line doubles the games that run at 240p up to 480p, which is a lag-free process, and then de-interlaces the 480i content, such as menus in games like Pokemon Stadium or Tony Hawk Pro Skater, and even Turok 2 seems to run entirely at 480i. But there is still a tiny bit of flickering on the edges of the image as a result. This is not uncommon, and this is probably fine for most people, and probably the best way to do it without introducing lag, but interlacing is just hell to deal with, and I hate it. Also, for games that do switch between 240p and 480i, there will be a brief dropout in signal when it changes. This is basically unavoidable when converting analog to digital, but is annoying regardless. My Magewell capture card ended up handling this transition way faster than my monitors, but you will still see a brief no signal screen regardless. A big issue when it comes to digitizing signals from older game consoles is input lag or input latency, the amount of time it takes for your action to be shown on screen after hitting a button. Back in the CRT days, this wasn't a huge issue, but the scaling and converting on LCDs and using bad hardware to do so frequently introduces input latency, which can be a deal breaker for some older games, and this is also why speedrunning tournaments and Smash Bros. Melee tournaments involve CRTs. I have 2 awesome video essays on CRTs linked in the video description if you want to learn more about them, by the way. I don't readily available have the hardware to test this kind of thing, but Bob from RetroRGB does, and let's see how his tests pan out. Does the Super 64 add any input latency?
Whenever I test devices like this, my #1 concern is how it affects the overall gameplay experience. And the #1 killer of a classic gaming experience is lag added to the output signal. Here's a good way to visualize this. The time it takes from when you push a button on the controller to when that action leaves the console's original video output is how these games were designed to be played. If anything between the console and the TV adds significant lag, that will ruin most people's playing experience. In most cases, people don't even realize the extra lag is there, but the games feel different, and most of the time, the harder levels are now harder to play as a result. In order to test the EON Super 64's lag, I installed a composite video cable directly to the N64's output port to allow for dual output. I ran that signal to a large CRT and ran the output of the EON Super 64 to a separate CRT and took slow motion video of them playing simultaneously. Here's 60 frames per second footage slowed down showing both menus switching on the exact same frame, which takes 16.5 milliseconds to draw. That's a good way to get an approximate measurement, but I don't like approximates, I like exact. So here's a 960 frames per second camera showing Mario jumping. If you break this video down, each frame will represent just about 1 millisecond or 1/16 of a frame. You could see the frame of the CRT screen being drawn in this video. That's the beam of light it's showing. And if I slow it down frame by frame, you'll see that both screens match both before and after the light draws the image. Overall, that proves that the EON Super 64 doesn't add any lag to the gaming experience.
Alright, cool. Your TV itself will add some latency of varying degrees, but the upscaling process from the 480p signal should be relatively smooth since it doesn't have to deinterlace or do any analog to digital conversion. So what about the slick mode button? This seems to apply a filter on the image that helps smooth out some of the extra obvious jagged edges in the gameplay feed in an attempt to bring it up to what you might expect 3D games to look like based on memory or emulators. This looks pretty great in screenshots, but doesn't necessarily hold up to motion. Especially in many of the lower resolution games, sometimes there are characters or details that are entirely made of just a couple pixels, and smoothing them out doesn't end well. Here's a list of games that I have tested, given that my collection for the 64 isn't super big, where I think the smoothing either looks good or just looks alright and usable on the system. And here's a list of games that I recommend keeping the filter off for. The problem is that it will need to be a per game choice, and you have to access the back of the console in order to change it, so I generally recommend keeping it off. There's a whole rabbit hole of issues with the blurry anti-aliasing process done to virtually every game on the Nintendo 64, and I'll point you to a video over on the My Life in Gaming channel to learn more about it. It sucks, and most games are blurry as a result when a lot of enthusiasts like myself want crisp, sharp pixels. But there's a workaround. Using the GameShark for the Nintendo 64, which is fairly easy to obtain at this point, I did have to call around to a couple local shops, but I got one for 15 bucks. There are codes for some games which actually allow you to disable that anti-aliasing filter in the game itself, allowing you to enjoy the games closer to how they should look, at least to how some of us think. Combining this with the EON Super 64 helps get you a cleaner overall picture on your stream. I'll have a link in the video description to a post over on RetroRGB.com that contains a big list of codes for Deblur. That's not the only way to improve the video quality out of this console though, and that's where this conversation gets a little messy. EON's previous HDMI adapter for the Nintendo GameCube utilized the available digital output to get incredibly clean signals not possible if you weren't willing to drop a couple $100 on the rare first-party component cables. I did. I regret it. Unfortunately, with the Nintendo 64, they can't just work magic, and you're stuck with S-Video in 480p. I said before that S-Video is the best possible video signal that you can get native out of original hardware without modifications, and that's true, again, unless you're willing to mod, or have someone else mod, your system, or buy a modded system. With that in the equation, you can mod your Nintendo 64 to support RGB and SCART connections for a much cleaner signal to then pass to a line doubler or upscaler like the open source scan converter or XRGB Mini FrameMeister. I have a RGB modded N64 myself, and I usually use this method, but this is already a far more expensive route. You have the cost of the mod kit and modding the system, and then the OSSC itself is about $10 US more expensive than the EON device, and the FrameMeister is twice as expensive and no longer even being manufactured. So while quality-focused enthusiasts and nerds like myself might prefer this kind of solution, it's already far less accessible than the EON Super 64. There's also the notorious UltraHDMI mod. This is also more expensive than the EON device itself, but it's also very rare to actually find the kit available, and pre-modded consoles easily go for $400 on the market at the moment. While it offers a ton of functionality and probably fulfills every dream wish list of a big N64 fan, it's far more prohibitive for most of us. Notably, this mod has its own deblur feature, which makes footage look even better and upscales to 1080p and so on. Thanks to DDR Boxman from the OES team for this footage. This isn't all to say that the Super 64 is the cheapest option. There's actually a cheaper and functionally identical product to EON's offering. This is the RetroTINK 2X, a small device made by Mike Chi, which takes any older game console that outputs a YPB-PR component, yellow composite, or S-Video connection, and line doubles 240p to 480p, and deinterlaces 480i to 480p, and outputs via HDMI. And it has a smooth button, which applies a filter to smooth out jagged edges, just like the EON Super 64. For all intents and purposes, these two devices are functionally identical when used with the Nintendo 64. In fact, their behavior and characteristics are so identical that I'm convinced that they use the exact same processing chip or very similar ones. The RetroTINK 2X uses a chip in the ADV7280 family from Analog Devices, and it's very likely that the EON device uses a chip in the same family as well. I tried to see if I could crack the case open to look into it, but without permanently damaging it, I had no luck. The difference being that the RetroTINK 2X is $50 cheaper than the Super 64 and is compatible with virtually every system, not just the N64. Okay, technically the Super 64 could work with the SNES or the GameCube if you can get it to fit, since they use the same connector and pinouts for S-Video, but there's far better options for both of those consoles. Now, thinking in terms of accessibility, there's certainly still a market that would prefer to buy and use the Super 64 because it doesn't require them to think. And I say that with some snark, but we all know people who would much prefer something that looks like a consumer product and is dead simple than something like the RetroTINK, which has a visible PCB, which seems to scare people, and a whole second button. But the RetroTINK 2X and the Super 64 provide identical results with virtually identical Nintendo 64 specific feature sets, while the RetroTINK 2X can work with GameCube, Super Nintendo, PS1, PS2, Genesis, Saturn, Mega Drive, VCRs if you want, virtually anything. The RetroTINK also offers a pass-through mode, which will directly pass through the 240p or 480i signal via HDMI instead of line doubling or deinterlacing it. But these modes are not really in the HDMI spec and require filler data to work, and may or may not work with your TV or capture devices, but it's there. For the cost of the Super 64, you can get a RetroTINK 2X and some nice shielded S-Video and component cables for your various systems, and connect more than one. However, RetroTINK setups involve a lot more cabling and points of failure and require their own USB power, as Bob added a note about.
For Nintendo. So overall, I just don't think the Super 64 is right for your average person, but I do see a use for it. If you're someone that runs N64 tournaments, that games on flat screens, there's a lot to handle in those days, especially if your tournaments are travel. They're not at the same place over and over. So that means if you have 20 N64s plus spares to deal with, you'd also have to have 20 RetroTINKs, 20 S-Video cables, 20 power supplies, plus extras, and to make sure that they're all working. Whereas the opposite, you could just grab one EON Super 64 and be done with it. So I think in scenarios like that, the extra cost would pay for itself just because there's less to worry about. I just can't see myself recommending this to your average gamer, because you just don't get nearly as much out of it as you would out of a solution that just really adds one more cable in the mix.
If you want to go super cheap, there are plenty of adapters on the internet that convert composite S-video and component to HDMI, but these will mostly result in poorer image quality, poor TV support, or bad input latency, as we discussed. AverMedia actually sells $40 composite and component to HDMI adapters, but they don't scale the signal, so it outputs a weird 480i signal, and while my capture cards do okay with it, though the quality is really bad, my TV won't even accept the signal. Weirdly enough, a lot of newer analog conversions are dropping S-video support as well. My TV has 3.5mm breakout adapters for analog video, and there's no S-video option, only composite and component. Disappointing. I did want to note, if you have a RGB modded in Nintendo 64, the Super 64 will still work with it, but it will still only pull the S-video signal from your console. EON has expressed interest in a revision that works with RGB mods, but I do wish they would have had included it from the get-go. Also, if you have the first revision of the RetroTINK 2X, it actually has an issue with the audio from the Nintendo 64 specifically being too hot of a signal and distorting at times. The second revision has fixed this, but the EON adapter does not have this issue at all. Admittedly, the Nintendo 64 has some really horrible audio, but it's there, and this does an obviously fine job of recreating it since it's a direct transfer. Lastly, before we get to streaming stuff, I wanted to mention that this kind of adapter is seemingly the perfect solution to use with the M-Cable Gaming Edition. Linus and others have full videos detailing these, so I won't get too far into it, but essentially they're HDMI cables with processing chips built in to cleanly and sharply upscale lower resolution signals to 1080p and 4K. You have to work with the native resolution output of your games, or in this case the exact line doubled resolution, so it doesn't work for a lot of emulators or modern systems, but it would work great here. Castlemania Games actually sells a bundle of these two together. I've not tested this personally, so I can't give an actual review, but I've reached out for a sample for the future, but I'll link some reviews in the video description. Alright, streamers, here's what you need to know. Again, the signal output by the Super 64 is 720 by 480 at 59.94 Hz, although it strays from that refresh rate a little bit. This isn't exactly 4x3, and you want a capture card that can handle this directly without doing some funky aspect ratio changes to the signal. I validated compatibility working to some usable fine degree on all of these capture cards. And I validated that this is not working or working correctly with all of these capture cards. A couple special notes, while the Live Gamer Portable 2 works with this in all modes, the Portable 2 Plus only works with it in the PC connected mode via RE Central, or Rec Central as it's apparently called. I don't know why, but that is the case. Also for Elgato cards, you will want to use OBS instead of Elgato's capture software and manually manage your HDMI ranges, as I've seen reports of it looking fine in the software, but the recording still ends up washed out. The signal from the Super 64 is in the Rec 601 color space, as is all S-video and composite standard definition signals, and a max of 422 chroma subsampling since that's all S-video can support. Ideally, a capture card that supports YUY2 would be used here, but NV12 is fine too if that's what you've got, or YV12. You absolutely want to make sure that both OBS and your capture device settings in the advanced tab and in your video device properties are set to partial RGB or YUV ranges. If you mismatch these, you'll end up with either super punchy and contrasty and video that isn't usable, or super washed out and noisy video that everyone will hate. The signal from this device looks really good, you just have to make sure that everything matches. All of this talk applies to the RetroTINK 2X too, by the way, just so you know. If you wish to capture this directly in OBS just for gameplay, I recommend setting OBS to 720 by 480, 5994, and then do the same with your capture card so that everything stays even. Then you can use Virtual Dub to cleanly scale using nearest neighbor scaling and crop off the extra black, or crop that with Handbrake. I'll link a tutorial from Bob at RetroRGB in the description as he beat me to the punch on covering those little details. If you're including it in your existing streaming layout, I definitely recommend designing around even scaling the size of the feed. So 480p to 960p. Also, when scaling the 480p source in OBS, play around with the point or area scale filtering overrides, as at least area is supposed to sort of be nearest neighbor, and it's supposed to work better for this kind of gameplay. It's not exact, but it should be better. You might be asking what's up with the black bars or black borders. Well, this is another rabbit hole entirely, but games on older consoles rarely ran at an exact measured pixel resolution of 320 by 240 or 720 by 480, etc. There's different sizes and ratios and pixel counts and room left for overscan. There's a lot. You'll see some of the gameplay I showed is much wider than others. They also didn't run at a 1:1 pixel aspect ratio, and the games weren't actually 4:3. But our old CRT TVs handled all of this for us and we never noticed, but converting and locking to digital standards means some degree of pillar boxing, letterboxing, or both, and that is unavoidable. Again, I'll point you to My Life in Gaming and RetroRGB for more deep diving on this topic. It's very nerdy and involves maths. All that to say that there's no way to avoid this, and that doesn't mean it's not working right if you see it. If you have your HDMI ranges set to limited or partial and matching across all your settings, then the black border will be exactly black and blend in with black backgrounds. I recommend finding some way to integrate or deal with this natively in your streaming layout, as cropping the frame would require changes be made every time you switch games, or you could force stretch it within a frame of some sort as well. Up to you, but this is a normal thing when dealing with analog to digital conversion. Last note, I had a horrible time getting games to output on 3 different Nintendo 64 systems with this device, and it turned out that it was my UPS battery backup system that was causing power frequency to be in a manner that the system didn't like. So maybe don't hook yours up to one.
As a cool quality of life thing for the Nintendo 64, the past year or so have seen a couple different companies introducing alternative Nintendo 64 controllers to play on the system due to how unreliable the original one can be and how weird of a layout it is. And so specifically I had pre-ordered the Brawler 64 controllers in the atomic purple and jungle green colors from Castlemania Games, and they got here literally as I'm in the middle of editing the video, which is already 4 hours late and going to suffer for it, so I can't really review them here. I will say it feels great in the hands. The layout makes a lot more sense for my hands and for controls in the kinds of games where my gameplay suffers in, and they look great, but I will have to do a formal separate review on the gaming channel later on.
Alright, conclusion time. Honestly, the Nintendo 64 is one of my least favorite consoles. I had a nice bright translucent green, I think it was the watermelon colored one, when I was a kid. Made it further in Super Mario 64 than I had in almost any game at the time, given that I never completed games. And then my neighbor stole and trashed my copy of the game, and I wound up only playing Mario Kart and Pokemon Stadium until its end of life. So getting to play Pokemon Red and Blue on the TV was a blast. That was pretty much the only way I played once I discovered that. Then back in 2009, I lost that console in a flood, and now I'm stuck with these ugly, boring gray ones. The image quality is meh, the performance in most games is pretty poor, the hardware was unreliable, and the controls were awful. Although there's quite a few new Nintendo 64 controllers coming out to alleviate that, and I have a couple on the way. I was hoping they'd get here for this video, but maybe I'll review them over on the gaming channel at youtube.com/eposvoxgaming. I still find inverted look controls to be unplayable for me. But all that being said, many of the games have a lot of charm, and it's a precious system to many. EON's Super 64 bring that system, all of its memories and gameplay, to the modern TVs with minimal effort, but at a hefty price tag. Given that we're not likely to see an FPGA-based clone console akin to the analog Super NT Mini and Mega SG systems anytime soon, this may be one of the best options for people really wanting to get their Nintendo 64 playing on modern TVs or streams. But I still have really no choice but to recommend that they go with the cheaper, but otherwise identical and more functional RetroTINK 2X instead, as there's no real argument of it being a better choice overall. Again, big event crowds and specific niche cases aside. What's your favorite game for the Ultra 64? Comment below. While you're down there, hit the like button, get subscribed for more tech education, and check out my affiliate link to Castlemania Games, where you can save 10% with the coupon code EPOSVOX at checkout. Then get an EON for providing me with this sample for review, but it's not sponsored video, no one saw us before it's posted, anything like that. I'm EPOSVOX, here to make tech easier and more fun, and I'll see you in the next one.